Good afternoon. I will start the class on vindication of the rights of women now. As we saw, we were discussing about the argument that Mary Wollstonecraft had placed in her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And now we will pass on to the next portion, next part. She directs her argument to the middle class woman because this woman lives in a, as she says, quote, natural state. By contrast, the aristocratic woman, Wollstonecraft explains in her introduction, is dissipated by great wealth and is incapable of any redemption by education. Eventually, the aristocratic woman's class will be eradicated in a reformed society. Now, Wollstonecraft did not explain, however, why she has excluded the poor woman from her audience, nor can her reader be certain what the status of the poor will be after reform, except that they will be less miserable. Wollstonecraft was far from indifferent to the sufferings of the poor, which makes her failure to provide for their relief in the Vindication all the more curious. Her pity for the poor had been sincere and profound throughout all her writing, and continued to be so after the Vindication was written. 3 years later, while traveling in Scandinavia and preparing the letters Johnson published, Wollstonecraft was moved to write with a mixture of sorrow and anger when watching peasant women scrub linen in cold water, their hands already cracked and bleeding. These were women, quote, to whom the most menial and even laborious offices, unquote, are left while, quote, men stand up for the dignity of men, unquote. And years earlier, Wollstonecraft's most memorable criticism of Edmund Burke in The Rights of Men was that his proud chivalry was callous and indifferent to the brutality inflicted on poor women. While Wollstonecraft obviously sincerely pitied poor women, and while she found individually their simplicity and frankness of heart appealing, she is not concerned in the bulk of her writing to suggest what kind of change they may look for in a reformed society, except that in overthrowing the tyranny of the aristocracy they will be restored to happiness. Except for an occasional suggestion for dividing up large estates into smaller farms in the letters from Scandinavia, and a suggestion to Burke that he find employment for women rather than squandering arms in The Rights of Men, Wollstonecraft leaves the issue of what the poor woman may expect after reform for the reader of the Vindication to determine alone. But the reader may easily assume from the Vindication that Wollstonecraft did not believe the poor lived in a natural state. The mind-numbing routine of domestic drudgery put the poor woman beyond the call of abstract argument. Wollstonecraft was not one to idealize the state of poverty. She had been too close to it herself. The life of the poor was more brutalizing than ennobling. The ideal existence, as this one described in the Vindication, was one in which women were, quote, raised sufficiently above abject poverty not to be obliged to weigh the consequences of every farthing they spent, and having sufficient to prevent their attending to a frigid system of economy, which narrows both heart and mind, unquote.